Hey, and welcome back to part 5 of our tutorial on how to make a Wordle game in Scratch. So in our last episode we made good progress. We've been entering letters across the rows of the Wordle game board, and as we finish a word, we're compiling the individual letters into a single variable and then checking that variable against a huge list of English language 5-letter words. So at the moment, if we've spelled a word that's an actual word, we get a little ding sound, and that's all that's happening. So this episode, what we'll be doing is actually looking at the individual letters in the word that we've entered and comparing them to the letters in the winning word, the puzzle word that we're trying to figure out in this game. So let's get involved in a little bit of costume changing and looking at the details of this word letter by letter, and I'll get into that right now. So I'm back inside my Wordle development file. You can find a link to that down below. And that has all the code that I've worked on in the first 4 parts, and anything that I add today will be in there as well, of course. So we're inside the letters block, the main block that generates the puzzle board here. And last week we went down below here and added this custom block called check word. So we've taken the letters that we've entered, added them all to a variable called entered word, and that is the word that we've actually completed this row with. And so last week we went in and compared that entered word to a massive list of words in the English language, and if the word existed on that list, it would generate a number here, which would be anything above 0 will basically tell us that it exists in that word. Now, originally the script was just set up here to ring a bell to tell us that the word did exist. Of course, we want to go beyond that though. What we want to start doing now is look at all the letters in the entered word and compare them to the correct answer to the puzzle. Now, a couple of things we had to do to get ready for that, and I've updated this file with a new variable called puzzle word, which you can see here. And we're going to be comparing our entered word to the puzzle word to see whether or how close we are to a correct guess here. Now, anyone who's played Wordle will of course remember that the way that we can tell how close we are is by what colors the words are as the letters are as they're flipped over for the puzzle. Now, I tried playing around just with color effects to try to get these tiles to change color, and I wasn't very successful. So I've actually gone in and updated all the costumes for this puzzle. You can see here that I've actually got 4 different colors here now, and they're in a very specific order. I start off with the white version, which is the unassessed version, and then we go to yellow, which means that we have the correct word but in the wrong place, and then green, and then lastly to gray. And you're going to see in a couple of minutes that we're going to do some fancy next costume stuff that we'll get as we're comparing these letters, and that will make sure that they're all in the correct color depending on what the status of the individual letter is. So if you've been working on an earlier version of the file, I would recommend you refresh and reload with these new graphics. I've also added some keyboard graphics that work the same way, and that's for the virtual keyboard that we're going to put on the right side of our screen, and we're going to be doing that in our next session. But there's well over 100 costumes in there that you're going to want to place down as well, and so you'll want to get this version of the file that has all those graphics set up in it. Okay, so our next step is going to have to be assessing the letters in this entered word one at a time and checking to see if those letters exist in our puzzle word. So in order to do that, we're going to have to first of all look at these letters by letter ID one at a time. So we're going to use the trick that we've used before as well, where we're going to use a variable called I. So let's go set our I, and that's going to we're going to want to set this I to match up with the ID of the particular letter that we're looking at here. So for in row 2 here, for example, we want to be looking at ID 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So to do that, we just do a little bit of math here based on the row number. So we're going to take the current row number, which is stored in this variable here. We're going to subtract 1 from it so that we're looking at the row before that. We basically want the last ID number just before the one that we're about to use right now. So if we take the current number, row number, and subtract 1, I'll run you through an example of this in a minute, and then multiply it by 5. So what does that get us? So if our current row is 2, 2 minus 1 is 1, times 5 is 5. So that will be ID number 5, which is the block right before ID 6, which is the square that we're looking at here. So as soon as we get into here, we're going to change our I by 1, and then we'll be looking at the proper square. Let's do that again for a different row. Let's say we're in row 4 here. So 4 minus 1 is 3, times 5 is 15. And that will bring us to the last square before this one, and then when we advance our I by 1, we'll be looking at the first square in row 4. So this code will work just perfectly to us. So we're going to set I to where we want it to be, and then we're going to go through this list 5 times. So we're going to grab a 5 times loop and plug it right down below our set variable here, change that to 5. And inside there, the first thing we're going to want to do is change that I by 1, as I said. So let's go down to our variables, change our I by 1. And so now we will be looking, if we're in the second row, at ID number 6. Right, so now we want to have a look at that square that we've selected here with our ID, and have a look at what costume it's wearing, meaning what letter it's currently holding. And then we're going to compare that to our puzzle word. So unfortunately, we can't do that in this spot. We've talked about this a couple of times in this tutorial, but custom blocks, a reminder, they cannot be used to check on clones. Just like the green flag block can't be used to command clones, it can only be used to command actual original reference objects or sprites. So in order to check a clone, we would have to start with a when I start as a clone, or in this case, we could start with a broadcast. Broadcasts are clone sensitive. Clones will respond to those. So we can do a broadcast here that basically checks the letter and then comes back to this spot again so that we can go around the loop one more time. So we're going to have to use a broadcast and wait here to give time for this little routine to run before we go around the loop again. So let's go grab a broadcast and wait and plop it down here. And we will call this new subroutine that we're starting here, we're going to call it check letter. All right. So let's go grab a when I receive from the events block here, and we'll change that to check letter. And so in here, we want to make sure we're addressing only the one clone now that we can talk to clones. So we're going to do the same thing we've done elsewhere here, where we're going to put everything here inside a big if statement that checks to see if my square ID is equal to the ID that we've selected with that letter I here. So we're going to go square ID. If that's equal to I, that's going to mean that that one letter that we're looking at right now is the only block that's going to be affected by what we do down here. All right, so before we assess the letter, which is going to be a matter of switching the costume, we want to do kind of a transition effect to show the player of the game that we're actually looking at that particular letter. Now, in the original Wordle game, we flipped the letter over in 3 dimensions to reveal what it looked like underneath it. Now that would be really complicated in Scratch because we can't actually flip things in 3 dimensions in Scratch. And in order to simulate that, we'd have to create a whole bunch of extra costumes for every letter of the alphabet to show it slowly being flipped over. So we're going to do a little workaround to save ourselves some trouble here. Let me grab a repeat 10 loop. We're just going to have our tile fade away and then fade back in again in order for while we're switching the costumes around, and that's going to create a nice transition that players will be able to see that letter is being evaluated without having to go through the trouble of changing costumes. So we're going to go change color effect here, and we're going to, instead of saying color, we're going to change that to ghost, which of course determines how faded out your project is. So we're going to repeat 10 times by a factor of 10 here, and that's going to bring our ghost effect up to 100, which will basically make our object disappear. While we're in here, I'm just going to duplicate this repeat 10, and we're going to go and change that ghost effect by -10, which will bring it back down to 0. So our evaluation is going to be kind of sandwiched in between here. It's going to fade out, we're going to switch costumes, and then we're going to fade back in again when we're done. Okay, so inside of here, we want to do an if-else statement. So let me pull this out for a second. Let's grab an if-else statement. And so here's the spot where we're going to be checking that costume that that letter's wearing and seeing if it exists inside of the puzzle word. So that's a fairly simple matter. We're just going to grab the green operator block here that's called contains. Apple contains A is the way it looks in the default configuration. And you guys will remember, this just gives you a yes or no. It looks inside of a word and tries to see if that letter exists. So if I click on this test version, for example, I can see that true, Apple does contain the letter A. If I enter a letter like Q, for example, it'll come out false, because Apple doesn't contain the letter Q. So let's drop that in there, and we're going to use that to compare the puzzle word. So on the left side here, we're going to grab puzzle word, and we're going to compare that to the costume that this block is wearing, because that will tell us the letter that it's currently configured to show. So let's go to our looks, and we'll go grab costume, not costume number, but costume name here. So if that letter is in the puzzle word, then we'll be successful. And what we can do here is do a next costume, which will switch that costume over to yellow. Otherwise, if it's not in the list, we want to switch it to gray, which is actually 3 costumes over from our existing white one. So if we're on the letter A here, for example, we can just add 3 to our costume number, and that will get us over to a gray square here, which is what we want it to look like. So we can go switch costume to, and we're gonna have to do some math on our costume number here. So I'm gonna go grab a plus sign, and let's go back to our looks, and we'll grab a block here that says costume number plus 3, and that will put that gray costume on our guy. Okay, so we're ready to test this out now, I think. One thing we're going to have to do, though, is we're going to have to enter a puzzle word here. So let's go to our variables, and we'll set puzzle word to, let's just pick the word ghost, G-H-O-S-T. We'll click on that to enter that information in there. Okay, so we're ready to test that out now. We want to enter a word here that's similar to the word ghost, that at least has some letters in common, but not all of them, of course. So I'm going to enter the word tiger here, T-I-G-E-R, and you can see that tiger has the T of the word ghost here. It has the G from the word ghost here as well, but these other 3 letters don't match. So if this is coded properly, we should be seeing yellow, gray, gray, gray. Let's give that a try and see what happens. Yellow, gray, gray, perfect. So that wasn't as difficult as we thought it would be, and we're looking quite good now. So our evaluation isn't quite done here yet, though, of course, because we still want to see whether this letter T is the first letter in our puzzle word or not. Now that's a little trickier than you'd think, so let's go have a look at our code. So firstly, we're going to want to do that evaluation inside the yes part of this if statement. So we're only interested in this letter if it hasn't turned gray, because only yellow letters are eligible to turn green. And what we're going to do is pop another if statement in here inside the first if statement. And if that turns out to be true, we're going to do a next costume, which will turn it from yellow to green. So what are we comparing? We want to compare the letter. Imagine we're thinking about the T in tiger here, for example. We're going to compare the first letter in the word tiger, the letter of the block that we're looking at right now, with the first letter in the word ghost. Now that's a little trickier than it looks. We're going to start using the operator that's called letter 1 of Apple. And so that will report back the letter A in the case of Apple. So we want to look at letter 1 of the word tiger and compare it to letter 1 of the word ghost here, right? So we're doing a comparison here. We're going to need an equal sign. And let's plug that letter 1 of apple here into the left. And now we have some more bubbles here that need to be filled. Now, the information, so we're looking on the left side here at the puzzle word. So let's go ahead and grab puzzle word and pop it into the spot where the apple is. That is the word we're looking inside. Now we want to be looking at the first letter of the word, of the puzzle word, ghost. But in some cases we're going to look at the second or the third. It's really the letter that matches the placement of the block that we're looking at right now. Now the only information we have about the block we're looking at right now is square ID, right? We said that square ID will match up with the block that we're looking at right now. So we know the ID of the square we're looking at. It's 1 in this case, and so we could look at letter 1 of puzzle word. But in the next row, if tiger was our second choice here, the ID of that letter would be 6 and not 1. So how do we turn that number 6 into 1? Again, it's going to be some math that we're going to need to do on our current row. So we've got the square ID, and we're going to have to do some math to it based on our current row to turn that number 6 into the number 1. So it took a little bit of puzzling around here to come up with this. Let me show you the final math that I came up with. So we're going to need a minus sign here, and we're going to take our current row minus 1. Now this is going to make complete sense to you. This is something similar to what we did last week, but just bear with me and I'll run this scenario through a few different iterations here and you'll see how my math does work out. So current row minus 1. So if we're in row 2, we're going to be looking at row at the number 1 and multiplying it by 5 again, just as we did earlier. So current row minus 1 times 5. So if we're looking at row 3, for example, that would be 2 times 5, which gives us 10, which is the number of the block just before the ID that we're getting into here. And so we're going to take our square ID now, square ID, and we're going to subtract from that. So let's grab a minus sign. We're going to subtract all of this stuff from it. So how's that going to work again? So let's look at this one more time. So if, let's say I'm interested in the letter G in the middle of this word here, which actually does match up with the G in ghost here, right? So, but I'm doing it in the third row. So I've entered T-I-G-E-R here, which means that I'm looking at square ID number 13, right, in row 3. Okay, so you guys get that scenario. So current row is 3 minus 1 is 2. 2 times 5 is 10. So we've got the number 10 here. Now, if I take the square ID, which is 13, and subtract 10 from it, I am left with 3, which is the third letter in the word, in the puzzle word. So by doing this math, no matter what row I'm in and what block I'm in, if I just take the square ID and subtract it from the current row minus 1 times 5, I'm always going to end up with the position placement of that particular letter. All right, so the math is a little weird, but it does in fact work every time here. So I'm going to grab all of this and place it into the spot where letter 1 is. So that's going to be letter 3 of our puzzle word if we were looking at the letter G for example here. Okay, we want to know if that letter matches up with the costume that this guy is wearing, but he's no longer wearing G, the costume named G. He's wearing the costume called G1, right? So that's not going to work in this comparison. So in order to get the right side of this equation looking properly, we're going to have to take the name of the costume and only look at the first letter of it. So I'm going to go letter 1 of costume name. Costume name. Okay, I'm going to create a little more real estate here because we're overlapping. And so this should theoretically now look at the first letter of this puzzle and compare it to the first letter of the answer, and then look at the second letter and compare it to the second letter of the answer. Okay, so let's test that out with a new word here in this next row. I'm going to try the word goats, G-O-A-T-S. Now there's not usually pluralized words in Wordle, but this word works quite nicely because it has many of the letters in the word ghost, some of them the right spot and some of them not. So my prediction here, based on the rules of Wordle, is that we will get a green block here for the G. We will get a yellow block for the O, which is in the wrong place. We'll get a gray block for the A, which doesn't exist in the word. And then the T and the S, which are both in the wrong position, will turn yellow. So we should be seeing 3 yellows, 1 green, and 1 gray. And drum roll, please. Green, yellow, gray, yellow. Beautiful! Well done. Okay, so it looks like our letter sorting system is working nicely now. Excellent. All right, so our game is looking a lot like regular Wordle right now, and I'm very happy with our progress, but there's one huge part of the program that we haven't looked at, and that is the virtual keyboard. Remember that in the regular Wordle game, there's a keyboard at the bottom of the screen that lets you enter text and also helps you keep track of which words, which letters you've already selected, and whether they're yellow and green. So we need to add a virtual keyboard. Because of the shape of our scratch screen, we'll put it on the right hand side, and it has to allow us both to enter text and it has to reflect the text that we've already entered so that we can see whether those letters are coming up as yellow or green or gray. So that's the subject of our next episode. We'll see you in a bit.